Hello, it's the Great Canadian Bagel here, coming to you with the final update to the Canadian federal election prediction series. Obviously, the election is tomorrow, so this is going to be the last forecast because this is also the last day that polls will be published. Because I'm not 100% certain if it's illegal, but most jurisdictions have a law against publishing polling data on election day. So I don't and historically, there's never been polls on election day, so I'm pretty sure it's also law here too. Not 100%, but that's not that's neither here nor there. So let's dive in to this final projection here. So, starting west to east, the Conservatives have picked up 2 seats again from the Liberals in BC, and so then moving into Ontario, the NDP have picked up 3 seats from the Liberals. Well, 3 from the Liberals, and the Liberals have picked up 1 seat from the Conservative. Or wait, no, sorry, I'm reading this backwards. Conservatives have picked up 1 seat from the Liberals, and the NDP have picked up 3 seats from the Liberals. And then the last one, this is something that I seem to be the only one forecasting, but the People's Party is projected to win Dartmouth Coal Harbor. Now, I will note here, my model is projecting it, but because of the intricacies and specificities of the People's Party, and that we don't have a historical record for where they're popular, and the polls have been very noisy for them, and particularly Atlantic Canada polls have been very noisy. That is my lowest confidence seat projection. They're projected to win it, but it has my least confidence in that result just because there's so much noise in the data and there's so much question marks given the lack of historical trends that we can look at for that party. We don't really know, but for now they're projected to win it. If it turns out tomorrow the Liberal incumbent wins the re-election, no one should be terribly surprised based off of this projection. If I were to give a percent chance, I'm going to say it's like 51-49 for the People's Party candidate. This could also be wildly off base either direction, depending on how much this People Party support is actually real. Because if we just pop over here for a second, so I have the People's Party projected about 3.35% of the actual vote, specifically 6.5 in Nova Scotia. But, and this is a big but, we don't have Nova Scotia broken down in any of the particular polls. So all I have are numbers for Atlantic Canada, and due to the way the models are, I'm projecting Atlantic Canada ones into the provinces of Atlantic Canada, we're getting this result, but I don't have a lot of confidence in any of these People's Party numbers because I don't know where they are and I do not really have historical trend to look at to solidly observe it. So I think the polling average here, about 3.9 for Atlantic Canada, is probably pretty accurate. The question mark is this an accurate description of it? I'm thinking PEI, for example, is woefully underprojected by the model, but again, I can't really fix that because I don't have data to go off, so anything I would be doing would just be a wild guess. Which might be better than not putting a wild guess, but that's against the spirit of what I'm trying to do. The only editorial decision making I'm trying to do with polls in my model is whether they're included or not. And incumbency bias, which is my own number that I've picked, and I guess also the decay rate. But other than those three factors, I'm trying to reduce editorial bias in this, so I'm not tweaking PEI's numbers so that it looks plausible, because I don't know what's plausible in PEI, so that would just be an editorial decision what I think is plausible, and that's not a meaningful choice. It's not a real decision. So expect these numbers to be very different on election day. And the reason for this is there were 0 People's Party votes cast in PEI in 2019. Or if it's not 0, it was pretty close to 0. Whereas, and I think that's because I didn't run candidates in most of PEI. I'm not 100% certain. I haven't looked into this, but they are definitely running candidates in every riding there now. And the party has a much higher profile this election, so you would expect some votes. Probably more than 0.2%, but we'll see. The one last change here I will note is New Brunswick is now in the light red category. In that, if we go back here, this is easy to see. Liberals are projected at 39.2% of the vote, and they're projected at 40% on the dot in Ontario. So it would be not unreasonable to expect the Liberals will underperform in Ontario by that much, or will go under 40%. That is not an unreasonable outcome. Every other province, I'm pretty confident in where they're placed, except, and this is a big exception, if the People's Party's support that has been seen in the polls is real support. Because again, there's the polling intention of someone saying, I like the People's Party, and then there's, I'm going to vote for the People's Party in the ballot box on election day or advanced polling. And if we go by this, what they're polling, what they said they voted for, which is, again, what someone said they voted for is not necessarily 100% accurate. It's likely more accurate than their intention to vote. These, Alberta and Saskatchewan in particular, could easily get up to 10% more People's Party support if the People's Party support in the polls, because some polls have had them that high, is correct. Now, there's a lot of reasons to doubt that it's that high. Principally, most minor secondary parties, so the Greens, the Liberal, or the NDP, and in 2019 the People's Party, underperformed their polling results. Likely, almost entirely, the likely reason being almost certainly strategic voting in the ballot box, or voter apathy, not voting. And there's reasons why you might, I could understand that. I think that is a bad way to view it. Even if your candidate has 0 chance of winning, you should go vote in that riding anyways, because it does send a message to the person who ends up winning the riding that you don't have as much support as you might think. For example, if you're riding my riding, if no one else voted, the Liberal candidate could easily win by 80-90% if a lot of people didn't stay home and vote. And now it suggests to the Liberal candidate that they can do whatever they want. They have overwhelming support. But if everyone goes out and votes, then that number will probably go down to winning with only 40 to 50% of the vote, maybe even less, depending on how strong the local campaign is. And that says it's very different thing. If you're getting in the low 40s versus the high 80s, that's a very big difference. Even low 40s versus the mid 50s. Because if you're above 50, that means over half the people in your riding voted for you. If you're under 40 or low 40s, you're just barely more popular than the next person. So there's a meaningful difference to the politicians, even if your candidate that you're voting for has no hope in winning. So this is what I'm saying. Always vote. Or I'm going to phrase this. If you want a party to win, always vote for that party. If you don't want anyone to win, don't, voting might be a waste of time for you if you don't care about anybody. Because at that point, you might be just randomly picking, but that's another topic for another day. We're here for the election. So there is one disclaimer I'm putting here, and this is because this is a relatively large editorial decision, but it's a result of how my model works. So Abacus released a poll today that includes polling data from today, if I'm reading the poll correctly. I'm just going to verify this in real time. Yes, it does include polling data from today. So because of that, I can't actually include it in this forecast because the way the weighting works is having one poll with data from today is going to extremely skew the model. Even though the abacus results are roughly in line, or not in line. There's a lot of noise in this election. That's important to note here. An incredible amount of noise in the polling. And different pollsters have completely different results. And it's very up in the air. And we'll go over possible election outcomes in a moment. But since this has data one, like today, so it's 1 day ahead of everyone else, it's going to be weighted less than other polls, or since the older the poll is, the less weight it considers. This abacus poll will have a very high weight, which will put a very large bias towards this one poll's result and not the aggregate. And for example, yesterday we have 7 polls, well 6, because the council poll I could not include either because the data wasn't working, like the link didn't work. I tried, but I'm not waiting much longer today to make this video. But the link could not work, so I could not include that video, or that poll. So ignoring that, we had 6 polls today, and all of those would be considered significantly less than this abacus poll, even though they're all roughly in part, and it would cause a big skew, so that's not being included. It's not to say that this abacus poll is necessarily wrong, or that it is a bad poll. I looked at the numbers, it doesn't seem that unplausible. But because of how my model is constructed, it cannot be included because it will heavily skew the result. And I don't think the skew it's doing is very plausible, or is realistic. And I'm not going to go into how it's skewing it because I've done the math, or I've run the model with it, but it's not important. So now let's get over the last few trends. So the last update, the Liberals had a decisive 11-seat lead. It was with the NDP support that would have led to a 172-seat government, which is very narrow, but likely stable enough to persist into at least the first budget. And if it passes the first budget, we'll probably go about 18 months, which is typically the average for a minority government. Since then, though, that was a projection from the 16th, there's been some pretty big changes. So the Conservatives' numbers haven't really changed. They're kind of fluctuating around 35.9. They're a bit above 35.9 now. They're a bit below on 16th, so they pretty much settled. But the big changes since the 16th, the Bloc is up 0.2, and the NDP is up 0.4, and the People's Party's up about 0.2 as well, and the other about 0.1. And a lot of this, well, some of it is from the Greens, who lost another 0.1. But most of this is from the Liberals. And particularly, it looks like the NDP is doing a very good job of stopping their supporters from strategically voting for the Liberals this election. And even more so there, I think Trudeau is losing his ability to scare the progressive voters into rallying behind him. At least that's what it looks like, because realistically, after being in government for 6 years, you can't really, especially since all of the issues in this election are not new. They've been around for at least the last 2, if not the entirety of the last 6 years, other than COVID. But realistically, none of the parties are really going to do anything amazingly divergent on COVID. And calling an election just to give people a chance to control COVID policy when all the parties basically have the same policy with some minor quirks is stupid. But ignoring COVID, every other issue in this election has been the same issue that's been for at least the last 2, if not the last 6 years. And we shouldn't be surprised then that Trudeau's having a harder time rallying support because, okay, housing. Well, housing's been a problem since you got into office, Trudeau. Why are you only doing something about it in this election? Why didn't you do anything about this before? Same thing with healthcare. You want to increase healthcare spending? Well, you could have done that any time in the past. Why are we only talking about this now? Maybe it's more prescient because of COVID, but the problems with the Canadian healthcare system have persisted for more than COVID. They were well entrenched well before COVID. COVID may have inflamed them, but they were well entrenched before then. So, because of a lot of these issues, or all of the relevant issues in this campaign, I think he's having a very hard time rallying people. And I wouldn't be surprised if he even underperforms 32.8. He could overperform it, but he very well could underperform this number. And the NDP could very well overperform their number as a result, because remember, my model is projecting the NDP at 17.75 and the Liberals at 32.82 because of NDP to Liberal strategic voting. That might not happen. And if that doesn't happen because the Trudeau is not able to rally the Progressives, well, you could see the NDP gain and it go to easily 20 percentage points, and the Liberals could go easily 31, even lower, which would cause a major rout. I don't think it's in the cards for a Conservative majority in that event, and actually I do have the numbers for this because I did the math. So we look at this. So the best case, so this is the most likely scenario now. 141 seats for the Liberals, 138 for the Conservatives, 28 for Bloc, 28 for NDP, 1 Green, 2 Peoples. So the first important thing to note here is that this Parliament will immediately fail. If this election result is returned, we'll be back in the ballot box probably in December because no one here will be able to hold confidence of the House. I don't think so. I do not believe. So first, Liberals, they get first chance. So they get Singh and Paul. Maybe. That's 170. Like, barely holding confidence. 1 MP is missing, dies, is sick, government falls. And that's assuming you can get the Greens and the NDP to agree to this. And it would likely have to be a hard deal because it's such a low margin. The Conservatives and the People's Party obviously won't try to prop up a Trudeau government. And Blanchett's already said he will not sign any hard deals. He will only do things on a case-by-case basis. If you're the Governor General, do you really believe that this three-party coalition is really going to hold in power? Because at that point, right, this three-party coalition, it's the Greens who have the entire veto of this. Maybe you could argue that the Greens could say no and Blanchett will support it. Maybe. But it's very difficult for that. There's not a lot of options, and having to get 3 parties to agree is going to be very difficult. And that's not just agree, like 1 party agree per bill. That's 3 parties have to agree on every single bill, every single confidence motion. It's going to be very fast government that's going to collapse. The Conservatives, if it does collapse, how I'm thinking it will, they will also immediately fail because realistically, they, with the Bloc and People's Party, could get 168. They would need the NDP to side with them, and I don't think the NDP's base will ever forgive Singh if he props up a Conservative minority government. The NDP could be bankrupt, and I don't think he could politically do it. I think it would be the smartest choice for him, politically. I'm going to rephrase this. I think it would be the smartest strategic choice for the NDP to prop up such a narrow Conservative minority, because they could basically just blackmail the Conservatives into doing anything they want, but I don't think the party and the voters and the grassroots would allow it. They would get rid of Singh immediately. So this result is going to be doomed. We'll see another election 100% by the next budget, if not December. And frankly, I don't really know why it would change very much. I guess the only possible outcome of another election pretty soon in either option would be, let's see, maybe the People's Party and the NDP supporters rally to the bigger party. Maybe. Could go the opposite. Very easily could go the opposite, but this is the most likely scenario. Now, the best case scenario for the Conservatives would see them up to 150 seats, the Liberals down to 126, NDP at 29, Bloc at 30. I'm kind of ignoring People's Party and Green for these best and worst case scenarios, mostly because they have 3 seats. It's not realistically going to matter. Like, sure, in the Conservative best case scenario, they're probably picking up a seat from the People's Party, but actually probably picking up a seat from the Greens too. But again, 2 seats. It's not going to make a meaningful difference. So this Conservative best case scenario, let's throw Boyce and Victoria into it. They have 152 seats. With Bloc support, they have a functioning majority. With NDP support, they have a functioning majority. That will probably be an 18-plus month minority government. Probably be pretty stable, and it likely would go. It might even go longer than 18 months. It depends on how fast the Liberals could do a leadership election, because Trudeau will 100% be sacked if that result happens. If Trudeau loses the election, I think he's gone. Because this was 100%, and the election did not need to happen. It was his choice, and if he loses, it was his fuck up. So, I think he's gone if he loses. Now, the best case scenario for the Liberals, conversely, they had to get only 8 more seats to 149. The Conservatives would go down to about 130, which a lot of overlap there. The NDP would go to 29, and the Bloc would go to 27. Not much movement. Not much different. That would create a stable Liberal government, as stable as a minority can be. They had 178 seats with the NDP, which is more than enough to realistically hold conference, because there's really never been a point where a party has lost more than about a couple MPs in a major conference vote. And with 178, they have more than a couple. They have room to lose more than a couple. In this result, I think Trudeau does stay on, though his party's very unhappy with him, and you probably get some yelled at behind closed doors. Paul's toast in either scenario, because her party's doing terribly. I don't think that's Paul's fault, but generally speaking, or I'm going to rephrase this, I don't think Paul herself is why the party is doing so badly, but because she's the leader, she's going to take responsibility for the failure, regardless of whether she could do anything about it or not. Blanchette will be fine. You'll lose even losing a couple seats here and there. The Bloc isn't going to, I don't think they're going to can him over that. O'Toole's toast if he loses this election. Regardless of how many seats he gains, he could go to 169 seats, but if the Liberals have 172, okay, maybe not in that case, but if he could have 160 seats and the Liberals at 78, the Conservative Party will probably toss him in the next leadership review. Maybe not. Maybe I'm being a bit overly dramatic for that, but he does not seem to be extremely or particularly popular among the Conservative base. Outside of, he might win the election, so they're kind of rallying to support him for the election. But we'll see if that actually matters, or if that holds after the election if he loses. Now, I will note, in this scenario where he only loses by 3 seats, I don't think the party will toss him. That's such a narrow... At a 3-seat loss, like I'm projecting, and if you also remember these margin of errors, or these best and worst case scenarios, there's almost 100% overlap in the best and worst case scenarios. Like the seat projection, if you look at 338 Canada for a second, I need to bring it up here. So we have 338 Canada here. So you look at these seat projection bars he has. So picture this, but these two bars are almost identical. Like he has a much larger Liberal bar than the Conservatives, but in my model has these as almost identical. They're almost the same size. So at this point, literally anything could happen tomorrow. The Liberals could win, the Conservatives could win. There could be a hung parliament. It could be a stable minority. The only thing that's unlikely to happen is a majority. There's really no place in the cards for a majority to happen. It would require a lot of really good luck or a big polling miss. Both can happen. But counting on a polling miss, a big one, and counting on luck is not a good model. You can't really forecast a polling miss because I guess you could do your own polls, but with a budget of $0, I cannot afford to poll people. At least not scientifically poll people. I guess I could poll random people. I could ask my friends. I could ask my family members, but that's not a good poll. So yeah, that is where we are right now. An extremely close, too close to call election. The Liberals are likely going to win, but any result, or either of the two main parties could win tomorrow. And if the People's Party numbers are true and they are they're outperforming even my model's project. I mean, my model's not super favorable to them actually for their popular vote projection, but if they're significantly outperforming my model's popular vote projection, it could cause a major reckoning among the Conservative Party. Now, I will emphasize here, the People's Party is not strictly drawing off Conservative voters. A large portion of the People's Party voters in 2019 were former Libertarian Party voters, because the Libertarian Party basically died in 2019 because of the People's Party. They're very similar. People's Party's a bit more... They're both very libertarian, but the People's Party, I would say, is a bit more... is mildly more social conservative than libertarians. Instead of being actually socially liberal, it's more like it's neutral. That's a bit in the weeds there, but... So yeah, the former Libertarian Party members, then there's definitely disaffected conservative voters, a lot of which likely because of the weak gun policies and carbon tax. But they do draw off members from every single party. They are the populist party that is drawing all the disaffected people of all political parties. This is an important thing that people often intentionally neglect when talking about a first past the post electoral system. They conveniently pretend that, oh yes, the NDP, the Greens, and the Liberals, they're all left-leaning, so their bases are interchangeable. You can add them together, and then they have a parliamentary supermajority. No. And the fall of the Green Party here is a prime example of why that naive thinking doesn't work. There's been a lot of polls done, principally Abacus, but other pollsters too, that asked people who they voted in 2019 and who they're going to vote for now. Roughly 25% of 2019 Green Party voters are going to vote for the Conservative Party. Or People's Party, if you combine the two together. It's roughly 25%. Now, that might sound silly on surface. The Green Party and the Conservative Party are very different. But that oversimplifies how people vote. People do not vote entirely based on ideology, and in fact, I would argue voting entirely based on ideology is a very bad way to vote. People vote for specific niche interests, people vote for specific candidates, people vote against specific candidates. And the Conservative Party has made changes to their policies, and the Greens have made changes to their policies, and that can change people's opinions of the party. This holds for any party. You can take any of these parties and you can remove it, and you don't know where people are going to go. You can delete the NDP tomorrow, and it's not certain that 17.8% of the people are going to suddenly vote Liberal. They might, but we don't know. You can never know until the NDP doesn't run or does amazingly bad. We only know that the Green Party's base is more than just very left-wing people because it completely collapsed this election, and we can see where they're defecting to, or at least where they say they're defecting to. Similar story with the People's Party. A lot of the defections that are happening, yes, the largest single group is the Conservative Party, but they're getting defections from every single other party. And a lot of new voters are also voting for the People's Party, people who were probably disaffected and never voted before. So, remember, strategic voting is a thing. It does matter. In a first-past-the-post system, it is an important thing to consider. But you cannot naively and as a result, you cannot naively add up people's or parties' vote results together, because these parties are all broadly left-wing, or they're all broadly right-wing. And in fact, I would even argue that almost all of the population doesn't vote based on ideology. They vote based off of niche specific interests. One person I know lives in a rural part of the country, or rural Nova Scotia, big gun owner, the classic person you consider social conservative. Votes typically NDP or Liberals for union reasons. If you deleted the NDP or you deleted the Liberals, he might be voting Conservative then, because his values identify more with the Conservative Party than they would identify with the Liberals or the NDP. But because union is such a huge issue for him, he tends to vote for those parties. And that's an important thing that everyone needs to remember. People do not vote for ideologies. Like 80% of the population do not vote because they're social conservative, or they're libertarian, or they're socialists, or they're social liberals, or they're whatever ideology you want to pick. The only exception is nationalists. Nationalists, like Quebec nationalists, will vote Quebec Nationalist Party more often than not. And that's a very specific and niche sub-ideology. Most other people, well, I guess technically, okay, I phrased that poorly. Regardless, I'm not going to correct it. Most people do not strongly adhere to any ideology. They have a strong internal value system, but they don't strongly adhere to an ideology, and a very good argument from a persuasive person can convince them to vote different ways in different elections. You can't naively say, as I saw a lot of people say in 2019, that 60% of Canadians voted for left-wing parties. That is not accurate. Or I'm going to rephrase this. That does not mean that 60% of the Canadian population is left-wing. It is accurate that 60% voted left-wing, but it does not mean 60% of the population is left-wing. You don't know that. That is not the question you asked in an election ballot. You asked which candidate in your local riding did you like the best. Now, to add to the baggage of the candidate, you have the party's platform, you have the party leader. But at the end of the day, in a first-past-the-post election, the question you ask the voter is which local representative did you like? Is it the best way to do an election? That's out of the scope of this video. But that is what the question is, and people like taking this question and reading more into it than they should. Now, a lot of the time, voters end up voting for parties that hurt them because they have one specific issue that they're voting for, but they get hurt in other issues. That's the cold reality of it, especially when you vote single issue voting. That's the cold reality of it. But that does not mean you can naively assume, yes, the People's Party is more right-wing than the Conservative Party, therefore they came from the Conservative Party. Or the NDP is more left-wing than the Liberal Party, therefore they came from the Liberal Party. These are not things you can assume. Now, it's very likely, in most scenarios, if People's Party voters would vote, and they couldn't vote for the People's Party, they'd vote Conservative. If NDP voters could vote, but they couldn't vote NDP, they'd vote Liberal. That's very likely, but we don't know for certain. So, with that said, I hope you all enjoyed the video, and if you did, please like, share, subscribe, comment on if you think I'm correct, or who you think is going to win the election tomorrow. Oh, just one final note there. Just to clarify this for some people who might not be on the up and up on this, and by that I mean not have read as much news, information about this as I have. So, the election tomorrow, at the end of the day, we're going to have paper ballots counted. Sorry, election day ballots counted, advanced polls counted, and overseas mail-in ballots counted. Then, the day after, we're going to have non-overseas mail-in ballots counted. They have to be counted last, because they have to make sure that someone who did not vote twice, by accident, on purpose, or whatever reason. So there is going to be at least 2 days of counting in this election. Will that matter? We don't know. We do know that 900,000 mail-in ballots were requested for non-overseas people. Now, if we have 18.6 million voters, as we did in 2019, that could be enough to turn the side of the election, or it really couldn't. Like, a lot of these mail-in ballots are in British Columbia, so that does put more weight to it on how we might not know the winner on election day. But this is at least at the moment, this is why we won't be done counting. I would keep your eyes out for other stuff, but almost certainly there's going to be about 1 million ballots counted on Tuesday evening when they count the mail-in ballots. With that said, one more final note. I keep adding final notes here. This one's not scripted. I will be taking a slight break after this. This is a lot of work. At some point, once I have all the numbers in, I will try to do a post-mortem if I'm particularly off. If I'm pretty spot on, I'm not going to bother. But if I'm off by a meaningful amount, I will discuss why I think my model was off and what individual parts I've fixed for that. But otherwise, do not expect a video from me anytime for probably the next month or so. I'm taking a break. This is a lot of work. With that said, I hope you all have a good day, and see you in a month, unless I do a post-mortem.